You know what? Sometimes you just feel like the table has been set, you know? Like the worship is powerful and the Spirit is here and God is going to do something great. And I feel that right now. And I hope you do too. Well, as we begin this morning, I want to do a bit of a feelings check-in, okay? Because last Sunday was a little bit intense. I want to know how your week was. I have to tell you, it was an interesting experience preaching about boundaries last week because of the facial expressions that I saw in the crowd. And I kind of thought we'd have some fun with it. I thought it would be a bit of a lighter topic. But actually what I saw on your faces, well, there was a bunch of different responses. One response was, yes, I love that book. I love Townsend. I love Cloud. I love the Boundaries book. I'm so glad he's talking about it. And some of you are nodding right along because you've read the book. You've done small group. Others of you were going, you had this like pained look on your face. Like, oh, okay. That's why I feel this way in this relationship. That's why I'm struggling with this person. Because I don't have good boundaries and they've been just overstepping boundaries left, right, and center. And so you had this sort of pained look on your face like, maybe I need to deal with this and I don't want to. And then there were a few that I wondered if you were thinking back in your mind and going, am I a boundary breaker? Have I been overstepping some boundaries here and there? And then I think you maybe had that little feeling in your stomach, that greasy feeling like, oh, no, I don't like this. So I experienced a lot of different emotions coming from you last week, and I wanted to check in about it. I hope you had a good week. I suspect maybe one or two of you went to somebody this week and said, you know what? Pastor Alton said I need boundaries with you. But I haven't gotten any hate mail, so I think things are okay. I hope it went well for you if you did speak to somebody about it. Always remember, the people who are going to get the angriest about you putting healthy boundaries into place are those who've been benefiting from you not having any in the past. They're the ones who are going to take it the hardest. Now, if you had that conversation with somebody, it took a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage because you need to be vulnerable. And I want to talk about vulnerability today. Before I go any further, I want to introduce you to someone called Brené Brown. Have you heard the name Brené Brown? Okay, she's a PhD. She's done a lot of study in the area of shame and vulnerability and happiness and joy and all those kinds of things. And she was a researcher that one day got invited, I think like 8 years ago, to do a TED Talk. And in that TED Talk, she shared her research on vulnerability for about 20 minutes, and then it just blew up. It blew up. It resonated so deeply with people all around the world that her name just blew up all over the place. And since then, she's written books and given talks all over the world, and mostly talking about vulnerability and everyone's favorite topic, shame. So, while I'm not an expert in either of these topics, although I have been told many times throughout my life that I'm shameless, I am going to rely really heavily upon Brené Brown. So if you watch any of her stuff, I'm going to crib it right from her because I'm not an expert in this field, and others that I've read along the way. What I'd like to do, the same with boundaries, is just introduce you to the topic so that you can do more research. Because obviously last week we just scratched the surface about boundaries, and we're going to do the same today. So, enough of that, let's get into it. Do you have many deep connections? Do you have any deep connections? And what I mean by that is, do you have people in your life that you can be just 100% yourself around? You can let them into your interior thoughts, into your fragile moments, into your brokenness, into those upside down moments in your life where you're out of control? Do you have people in your life like that? People with whom you are comfortable because with them you feel like you are enough, just as you are. I suspect that for many of us, we do not. That for many of us today in this modern age, and they've done studies, adults today have very few friends and even less people with whom they feel like they have a deep connection. And so the question that I'm asking is, do I have a lot of deep connections in my life? And I think the answer is no. And the next follow-up question, of course, is, well, is it them or is it me? Right? You know that old saying, it's become one of my favorites. If you meet a jerk in the morning, you met a jerk in the morning. But if you meet a jerk in the morning, in the afternoon, and the evening, you're the jerk. It's true, isn't it? We know people, it's always someone else's fault. Everything. They don't take ownership for anything. And you know what? I'm going to take some ownership of this. I think the problem is me, 100%. I have always struggled to make deep, meaningful connections. I'm really, really good at telling a story about myself that most people wouldn't tell, like too much information. I have no problem with that. So people from the outside might think, oh, he's an open book. And I like to be consistent. I like to act the same way at church on Sunday as I would on a Friday night down at the pub. But at the same time, there's this little guarded space in my soul that I don't want anyone to see. That I don't want anyone to see. And I think back to when I was a little kid. I was at Orchard Park Public School, Orchard Park Elementary in Stouffville, Ontario. And I'm in kindergarten, I'm in grade 1, and I remember I would go and find this wall in this alcove, and I would just stand against the wall, and I would watch the other kids play. And I was just miserable and lonely and alone. And I don't know why, because I had great parents, but there was something within me at that age, at the age of 5, the age of 6, where I just thought, I'm not worth joining in with those other kids. They wouldn't want to get to know me. They wouldn't want to play with me. And I don't want to be rejected. So I'll just hang out here by this wall in this alcove. And I would just hope and pray that someone would come up to me and invite me in and say, no, it's okay. You are enough. Because I've always had this suspicion about myself that I am not enough. How about you? Now, my response to this is F them. Forget them. Oh, some of you aren't good Christians in here. I see that. Wow. Yeah, that was a test and you failed. Honestly, though, forget them. And you know people like this, even into adulthood, and you might even be one, where it's like, well, you know what? Just F them. If they cross you, if they don't get with the program, forget them. I don't need them. And that was me. And sometimes it still is. So the problem arises when we don't feel like we're enough, because what enters into all of this is a sense of shame. If they really knew me and my brokenness and who I really was, and the things I thought, if they didn't always see me in my Instagram best, they just wouldn't accept me. And so we come up with a solution. Forget them. We armor our hearts. We become hard-hearted as we guard our hearts. We don't want people to see our weakness. We want to project an image of strength. And I'll tell you, the one thing that I personally do not want is vulnerability. I mean, when I just say that word to you like that, are you feeling vulnerable? How does that make you feel? Don't you just want to do anything you can to not feel vulnerable? Because vulnerable is a bad word. But here's some bad news for you and for me. The armor does not keep out pain. That armor that we surround our heart with to protect ourselves from other people, to make sure we're not vulnerable, to keep that shame at bay, and all of that, it doesn't keep out pain. But what it does do is it keeps us from accessing the things that vulnerability takes us to. It doesn't keep out pain, but it keeps out the good stuff in our lives. Creativity and joy and love and belonging, intimacy, trust, empathy, innovation, all of these things are birthed through vulnerability. Brené Brown tells a story about how after her TED Talk, all these really successful businesses called her up and said, "We'd like you to come speak to our crew. Come motivate us." Fortune 500 companies were just lining up. And they all said the same thing. "We have one request. Don't talk about vulnerability, and don't talk about shame." She said, "Well, what do you want me to talk about?" "Well, we'd like you to talk about creativity and innovation and things like that." And she said, so you want people to produce a product out of nothing, using nothing but their imagination, and pour themselves into it, and then present it to you for review and ultimately the whole world, and you don't want them to be vulnerable. It can't happen. Just about every good thing in our lives begins with vulnerability. And it's something that it took me about 40 years to figure out. Let's talk about at least just one of those things, empathy. Empathy. Do you know the difference between empathy and sympathy? Because I didn't know the difference for a long time, for a very long time. Now, empathy is something that fuels connection, whereas sympathy drives disconnection. Which is weird, because when someone says I'm sympathetic, that sounds like a good thing, at least it does to me. Empathy, you see, is feeling with people. And the difference is sympathy is feeling for people. So it's kind of like this. Let's say I fall down in a deep, dark hole. And I'm scared and I'm frightened and I'm lost and it's cold and I don't know how I'm going to get out. And I'm just down in this pit. Well, empathy is when somebody climbs down into that pit with me and sits beside me and says, "It's dark in here. It's really dark." And maybe if they've been there before, they might say something like, "You know, I've been in this pit before and it's terrible." Now, sympathy is someone sees you in a pit, they poke their head down, they go, "Looks dark in there. You want a sandwich?" You see the difference? The difference is monumental. And the difference between empathy and sympathy is vulnerability. You see, sympathy is how we respond when we don't want to be vulnerable to someone else's struggle. Sympathy is when we want to appear caring, or maybe we do care, but we just can't bring ourselves to be vulnerable enough to join them in that pit, to commit to the process of helping them get out of it. Sympathy is what happens at a lot of funerals. Now, if I would like to make this a little bit more clear, I would bring up this little phrase here, at least. Because rarely does an empathetic person begin a sentence with at least. So your car breaks down. Well, at least you have a second car, right? You lost your job. At least your wife still has a job. You're struggling in your marriage. Well, at least you have a husband to struggle with. When I was going through a difficult moment in my life, I want to say 8 years ago, we had gone through in vitro fertilization, and we had a great implant. And for 2 weeks, things seemed to be going really well. And then after about 3 weeks, it all fell apart, and my wife miscarried, and it was just such a dark time for us because we'd poured so much time and hope and money into it, and you can't just go down the next day to the hospital and get another fertilized embryo. And it was such a hard time, and so many well-meaning people said this to my wife, I think especially at work: at least you still have your stepson. You see, I call this bright-siding it, and I've got some people in my life that just love to bright-side everything. And what they're trying to do is your pain is now becoming about them. You understand that, right? They're uncomfortable, they're feeling vulnerable, and they do not like it. And when your pain becomes about them, they just want to make it go away. And so if they can bright-side it, maybe they can make it go away. Now, what does an empathetic person say? They say stuff like, that's just terrible. It's terrible. Husbands, take note of this, by the way. Husbands, we hate vulnerability. We really do. And one of the ways we protect ourselves is we have a plan. We see a problem, and we make a plan, and we attack it, and we overcome it. And your wife comes home from work, and she says, Kathy's been bad-mouthing me to Cindy. And you're like, well, here's your plan. Wives, what do you want to hear? That's terrible. That's awful. Here's something else they might say. I'm coming over right now, getting in the car. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Or they might even say, who do I need to punch? Who do I need to punch for you? And it's funny, I wrote this on Tuesday, and on Thursday, I'd had a kind of a bad day, and my wife saw me in the kitchen. She was looking at me. She goes, you're really off. Like, what's wrong? What happened? And she said, who do I need to kill for you? Which, if someone winds up dead, we'll delete the tapes, right? But that is someone who is empathetic because they're vulnerable enough to get down in that pit with you. And they're committed enough to go along that journey beside you, even if it means just sitting quietly in the dark together. As a pastor, one of the things I've learned is that when you're in the hospital bed in a tough situation, when you're sitting beside the hospital bed, you want to make it better and you want to just somehow ease the burden. But usually the best thing you can do is just sit and pray and listen. Now here's the problem. You can't fake empathy. You can fake sympathy or experience in reality, but you can't fake empathy. You can't connect without empathy because it requires vulnerability. And hard-hearted people, well, they hate vulnerability. And the really bad news is this: our capacity for wholeheartedness, as opposed to hard-heartedness, can never be greater than our willingness to be brokenhearted. You might need to read that one 3 times through to fully get it. But our vulnerability, our willingness to be brokenhearted, that's sort of the gatekeeper for everything else. Connection gives meaning to our lives, right? When God created Adam and Eve, he created them for a relationship. He created them to connect. And then, when he created Adam, he said, I'm not quite enough for him. He needs a helper. He created Eve, and they connected. And the whole fall story, as we looked at a few weeks ago, was about disconnection, about disconnecting from God through sin and disconnecting from one another as they feel shame for the first time. And Eve and Adam are at odds for the first time. Connection gives meaning to our lives, but it implies risk. And you see, for some of us, that risk is just too great. It's too great. And it's here that terrible word comes into play, and that word is shame. What is shame? Is it guilt? Is it regret? Is it remorse? I want to suggest that shame is the fear of disconnection. As we've already said, if people really saw me for who I was, they would disconnect from me. They would not want to be with me. Shame is the suspicion that at the core there is something about me that if other people know it or see it, that I won't be worthy of love or time or affection or even respect. That if people really knew who I was, I would not be deemed worthy of connection. And this is universal. We all experience it. Nobody wants to talk about it. And the more you don't want to talk about it, the more you have it. It's the answer to this question, I am not enough. And we live in this world of scarcity, don't we? We're continually bombarded by images and advertising and messages that tell us that there isn't enough. Not enough food, not enough money, not enough peace, not enough security or safety. And then deep down inside of you, you yourself are not enough. Whether you're not pretty enough or smart enough or fit enough or funny enough, maybe you're not rich enough or outgoing enough or even holy enough. We all wear a name tag that says, hi, my name is, I am not. Write in your answer, enough. Now, preachers will reinforce this message for you, and I think I've done it myself over the years. I mean, after all, the Bible says it, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And so what happens? We disconnect even from God. No wonder nobody comes to church anymore. We keep telling people that they aren't enough even for their Creator. And that if they need to go to church, or they need to read their Bibles more, or they need to quit drinking or smoking or quit swearing before God, we'll look down at them finally and say, finally, they're worthy of me. But church, that is absolutely not the case. It is true, we are not holy. And it is true, we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. That is absolutely the case. But we are enough. We are enough for God, just as we are. He made us. He loves us completely. He gave his lives for us. For some reason, we feel like we need to put on airs for God. Present ourselves as holy so that we could be accepted by the Holy One of all. You know what the rest of Romans teaches us? For all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, but all are justified freely by his grace through the redemption that came by Jesus Christ. God does not hold back his love until we can meet his standards. He is the ultimate originator of vulnerability. I have to think that when he created Adam and Eve, he kind of knew what was going to happen, that they would reject him, turn their backs on him and others, and he was willing to risk it. He's not expecting perfection from you. He's expecting connection from you and vulnerability. And over time, if you let him in, he will shape you more and more into who you truly were meant to be and made to be. And on the other side of this life, he gives us a glimpse every now and then that there is perfection on that side as we stand in his presence. He sees you for who you are, and he wants nothing more than to be seen by you. Now, can you imagine if that was the message the people outside the church were hearing? I think we might see a few more bums in the pews. But here's the trick. In order for connection to happen, whether it's with God, with our spouses, with our friends or coworkers, with anybody, we have to be willing to allow ourselves to be seen for who we really are. And that's risky. That's really risky. Now, according to Brené Brown, wholehearted people have 4 things in common. And I'm going to have to skip through this a little quickly. They have 4 things in common, and more, but just we'll start with 4. Number 1, they have the courage to be imperfect. They have the courage to be imperfect. The word courage comes from the Latin root word cur, which means heart. And at the root of this word courage, a definition could be to tell the story of who you are with your own heart. Courage means opening up, presenting yourself to the world. It takes courage to be vulnerable. It takes compassion. Vulnerability requires compassion, that you would be kind to others, but not just others, to yourself. Because honestly, if you really think about it, you probably have a much larger panel of critics up here than you do out there in the world. I remember somebody, and they were going through a rough divorce, and they said to me, "The whole town is talking about me." And I said, "Nobody is talking about you." And they weren't. Maybe for 5 minutes, and then they got over it, and they moved on. But she was carrying this for years as a burden, because that panel of shame, we're all holding up 10 saying you failed, and you did it spectacularly. Number 3, connection is made as a result of authenticity. It is really hard to connect with somebody if they're not giving you their real selves. And how are they supposed to connect with you if you're not giving them the same? It requires connection as a result of authenticity and an embracing of vulnerability. Deep down in our hearts, church, we need to believe that what makes us vulnerable also makes us beautiful. And we sing songs like that, don't we, team? Don't we have songs about, how God is making beautiful things all the time? And how does God do it? By accepting us where we're at, for who we are, and us presenting ourselves completely to God, openly and honestly saying, "This is who I am. Now what can you do with this?" Wholehearted people are comfortable being uncomfortable. They're comfortable being uncomfortable. For them, vulnerability is neither comfortable or excruciating. It's not on either end of the spectrum. Vulnerability is somewhere in the middle, and they're okay with that. They're the kind of people who will say, I love you, before the other person. They're willing to risk it. They've got that kind of courage. They will invest in a relationship, whether it works out or not. But what do? For us hard-hearted people, what do? Well, we want to numb vulnerability, don't we? We don't want to feel that. We don't want to open up to that. And so what we might do is pursue food or drugs or alcohol or shopping or social media or whatever it might be to sort of numb that feeling of disconnectedness with other people. Because we lack that connection, because we can't be vulnerable, and we are made to be connected in our faith and with other people. And then when we do this, what happens? We numb the vulnerability with these things, and then we feel worse, don't we? All the online shopping in the world doesn't replace intimacy. None of it. There isn't a logger invented that will fix that empty hole in your heart because you're disconnected from other people. So you feel worse. And you want to numb that pain. You start to feel vulnerable. You start to be reminded that you are not enough. So what do? Well, you go back to the food or the drugs, the alcohol or the social media or whatever it is. And around we go in this vicious cycle that leads nowhere. So with the 30 seconds I have left, let me leave you with the remedy and the encouragement to do some reading of your own down the road, if any of this sparks with you. Number one, allow yourself to be seen. Maybe not with everybody you meet, but at least pick some key people in your life and say, I want to go deeper in this relationship and I want to let myself be seen by you. Number two, love with your whole heart. Your whole heart. Not just part of it, the whole thing. Open up. Let people in. Number three, practice gratitude and joy. This one might seem like it's coming out of left field for you, but hard-heartedness is keeping everything at bay. We want to numb. When you practice gratitude and joy, when you spend time each day thinking about the things that you're grateful for, and here for us Christians, giving thanks to God for those things, when you open you're letting in joy, you're letting in gratitude, you're filling yourself with these positive things, and that starts to break down the armor on your heart over time. And number four, believe that you are enough. Not that you're perfect, and that's the whole point. But in your imperfection, you are enough for God, for me, for the person sitting beside you, and everybody in this room. Believe it. Then you will stop pretending. You'll actually believe it. I want to leave you with a verse from, it's from Isaiah. Matthew is quoting Isaiah. Well, Jesus is quoting Isaiah, and Matthew is quoting Jesus. So figure that one out. And whenever Jesus would quote something from the Old Testament, from the Hebrew Scriptures, I kind of take note. Go, that might be a powerful verse for me to remember. And here it goes. And see if this resonates with you and everything we've talked about today. God wants Isaiah to say to the people, you will be ever hearing, but never understanding. You will be ever seeing, but never perceiving. For this people's heart has become what? Calloused. They hardly hear with their ears. They've closed their eyes. Otherwise. Now, here, to me, I'm thinking this is where God piles on and says, and this is how they stink. They're hard-hearted. They're callous. They don't know me. They're not accepting the prophets. Let's hit the button and like Mr. Burns, the chute drops out and they're in a pit of hell. Let's do that. That's a good plan. They deserve it. But no. No. Oh, church, that's not what he says. Jesus is quoting Isaiah because he understands the passion of Isaiah as he looked out upon the people with these calloused hearts, and it broke him, and it broke the heart of God to see it. This is Jesus' heart here. He says, otherwise, they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts, and they would turn. And what will I do? I will heal them. I will heal them. This church thing, man, we've gotten it so wrong. At least what we presented out there to the world. We talk about who we're against and the stands that we take and the holiness that we have. God just says, you're so broken, you're so hard-hearted. I wish you could cast that off and just look to me. Because if you did, if you understood with your hearts what I offer, and if you turned to me, I would heal you. Let us make that our prayer for ourselves and for those around us, that we would let God in to heal us, knowing in the name of Jesus Christ that for him we are enough. Let's pray.